Well, today on the show, I'm joined by Professor Michael Huemer. Professor Huemer joins me to speak about his book, Understanding Knowledge. Understanding Knowledge is an introduction to epistemology, epistemology being the theory of knowledge. In this conversation, we hash out and unpick some of the elements and frameworks that Michael presents in his book so that I can present to you what I hope to be a safe space, an introduction to the world of epistemology. My desire is, from the back of this conversation, you want to go away and listen to other conversations that Professor Huemer has had on epistemology. You want to pick up his book, Understanding Knowledge, and dive in. And also, I hope it encourages you to want to enter into this fascinating field of epistemology, because it is daunting at first for many, but actually once you begin to swim in the waters, you can see how it does interact many arguments, it integrates with many reasons and explanations, and actually how a good understanding of epistemology will serve you as you come across other content and other avenues of philosophy. If it's your first time checking us out, I'd ask you to hit the subscribe button, and if you're on YouTube, select the bell notification icon. That will mean you're reminded whenever we release a video here on the show. And if you wouldn't mind giving this video a thumbs up and then sharing it with your friends, family, followers. I always say that we grow because you take the time to share our content, so please do that. Share it far and wide. Okay, I hope you enjoy this conversation on epistemology with Professor Michael Huemer. Cheers. Hello and welcome to the show. My name's Samuel, and once again I'm joined by Professor Michael Huemer. Professor Huemer, it's great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So you've been on previously to talk about your book, Knowledge, Reality and Value. Today we're going to be discussing your other book, Understanding Knowledge. Yes. I have a list of questions which we can dive into. There she is. Beautiful, beautiful. Which we can kind of just run through one by one. But I thought it'd be interesting to kind of start off talking about epistemology in general. I'm aware that you were hired at the University of Colorado there in Boulder to teach on epistemology from the get-go, I believe. I think it's a subject that a lot of people find quite daunting. So I thought it'd be quite interesting to kind of get your take on the sort of scale or the I guess the reflex people have when they hear words like epistemology. Sometimes they can be a bit like, this is above my pay grade, it's going to be too complicated. I kind of often feel like that myself when I try to dive into subjects like this. So would you mind speaking just to start with about how people should approach subjects like epistemology?
Oh, wow. I don't know. Just, they should approach it by starting to read my book. So, I mean, it's an unfamiliar word to most people. And actually, I mean, if you think that the topic is overly technical, that is a reasonable thought to have. Usually, I don't know, you probably start by reading introductory things for undergraduate student level. Okay, well, why do we want to learn about epistemology? And, basically my thought is, well, whenever you say anything, you're sort of implicitly claiming to know that thing. And this is shown by the fact that it doesn't make sense to deny that you know it, right? So like somebody asks you, what's the weather like outside? And you say, so I don't know, but it's raining. Okay, so that doesn't make sense. If you said that it's raining, then you have to say that you know. Right. Okay. And so, so sometimes when you feel like saying something, but you don't think that you know it, then you still say something, but you say a different related thing that you do know. Right. So what's the weather like outside? You go, I don't know, but I think it's raining. That sounds fine, but that's because, well, you do know that you think it, right? You don't know that it is. So, and if you think about this, it just seems like, well, every time you say anything, you're claiming to know it. And so in a way, epistemology studies the conditions for any assertion to be legitimate in any subject. So, applies across all different disciplines.
Yeah, and it's so rich. I find it, and it's so foundational to everything that we think we understand or we think we're engaging with. It's absolutely fascinating. So I mean, I hope that encourages people that might have just clicked on the video or started listening to stick with this. We're going to be diving into some technical terms, and we're going to be getting down to some depths today. But hopefully, this will provide a good introduction for people, and then they can go away and pick up understanding knowledge. Fingers crossed, anyway. Okay, so I guess let's start with 101. Kind of, what is the nature of knowledge, and how does it differ from things like belief or just opinion?
Yeah, so epistemologists don't agree on how to define knowledge. But by the way, that's not something unusual. Philosophers don't agree on how to define anything, basically. I mean, we never, like in the 2,000-year history going back to Plato, we never agreed, or more than 2,000 years, on how to define anything. But it's generally agreed that there's at least a couple of things that differentiate knowledge from mere belief. And the first is that knowledge has to be correct. Right? So like I say, does Sam know what time it is? And if you think that it's 3 o'clock, but it's actually 4 o'clock, then we would say you don't know what time it is, right? We can't say Sam knows that it's 4 o'clock if it's actually 3 o'clock. Okay, so it have to be right. And then the other thing is it can't be an accident that you're correct. You have to be non-accidentally correct, or it can't be a matter of luck. Like you guessed and by chance you happen to get it right. Right. So, you're looking at the way that you came to the conclusion that it's 4 o'clock is that you were looking at a clock on the wall. And this is one of the old analog clocks. And the clock is stopped, unknown to you. But it just happens to be stopped at the time that it actually is when you're looking at it. So it's actually 4 o'clock and it stopped at 4 o'clock. Okay. So do you know what time it is? Right. And then we would say, no, you don't know what time it is because it's just by luck that you got the correct time. Okay. And now the disagreement that epistemologists have is just like how you should define this notion of it being merely by luck. Right. And, like most people think, well, yeah, you've got to have like adequate justification. Like you have to have believed it for the right reasons that would make it rational to believe it. And then there's some other conditions required. Right. Some people say, well, it has to be that your belief forming method is highly reliable or something like that.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I know you kind of talk about these sort of kind of barns that somebody's driving down. So the example goes, somebody's driving down the road and they're in a country or in a county where it's full of different barns. And unbeknownst to them, they're actually looking at just the facades, the outsides of barns, but they aren't actually barns. Behind them, there's no barn-like structure. They're just seeing barns, and they're just assuming that these things are barns, but maybe one of them is an actual barn, but the rest are all fake, or maybe they're all fake. But it's this idea that kind of this person would be correct to say that this barn is a barn if it was actually a barn, but they wouldn't know that because depending on how you look at it, it just looks like a real barn, right? It could be fake, it could be real. You mentioned another one, such as like the sort of vase analogy as well, where there's a sort of hologram of a vase, but actually just behind that hologram, there is a vase that looks exactly like the hologram. But we're not making we're making a claim against something that isn't actually real. So there seems to be this sort of sense of reality, of sort of tangible accessibility, but sometimes we try and make decisions, or we try and go into places where we don't actually have the ability to know what is necessarily real. So how do we kind of begin to kind of, I guess, get our grips around sort of kind of reality and start proving that we know things?
Yeah, I mean, so, what those examples were supposed to show is that it's not enough to be right. Because like in the case with a fake barn country, like you're looking at the one real barn and all the other ones are fake. But you don't know that you're in fake barn country. Then it's just a matter of luck that you happen to be looking at the right one. Or, you're looking at the hologram of the vase, but by chance, actually there happens to be a real vase. Yeah. Okay. But, you're asking something like, well, how do we know that we know things, or, how do we know that we're correct in our beliefs? Like basically, well, we can't really know for certain. Um, our beliefs about the external world are correct. Maybe you can know for certain what's going on in your own mind, and maybe necessary truths, like you could know that 2 + 2 is 4. You can know those things for certain. Okay, but you can't really know for certain what's going on in the external world. So if that's what you want, then you're out of luck. But luckily, you don't need that. You just need like sufficiently justified belief in order to go about your life and like do perfectly well. Um, so okay, well, so how do we have sufficiently justified beliefs, to go about our lives? Basically, well, we start by assuming that things are the way they seem. That's what you should do, unless you have a specific reason for thinking otherwise. And that it turns out that works pretty well. That's my basic view.
Interesting. I think it would be good to dive into this just slightly more, because I think it's probably quite a common one that a lot of people begin to almost fear as they begin to try and work out whether they can actually know anything. So sort of this is an example that I've used with friends previously, and it's meant to kind of talk about sort of first degree and then second degree knowledge, which that sort of might not be the right term, but we can dive into it and we can talk about it, which is this case that if I was to give you $100 and you were to take the $100 from me, put it in your wallet, you know that you have $100. But then if you were to pull that $100 out later on and try and pay for something, it might be the case that, inflation over the last year has gone up by whatever percentage, but you're still utilizing what you thought you could buy with $100 from 6 months ago. So you knew you could buy this amount of bananas, let's say 6 months ago, but actually because the price of bananas have gone up, you can buy less than you would have been able to previously. So it's almost this idea that the sort of first level knowledge is that you have $100, but the second level knowledge is the ability to actually utilize the thing that you think you have. And actually sometimes I can imagine first year students or people that begin to slide into skepticism would begin to kind of not be able to differentiate between the two of those and think, well, we can't know for certain what we're going to be able to buy until we go and actualize that. So we're kind of always having this sort of meta knowledge rather than the first degree knowledge that we might necessarily want to adhere to. I don't know, that might be a poor example, but does that kind of make sense around us not necessarily knowing how we can actualize something?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, so just as a side point, like usually when I hear first order and second order knowledge, I think first order knowledge is like knowing that you have $100, and second order knowledge is knowing that right? Which is a little bit more demanding, right? But you mean sort of knowing the implications of that, or like the practical implications. I mean, your ability to know the practical implications is sort of would have the same basis as your knowledge of the first thing, right? Although, like in this case, well, it depends upon your memory, and it depends upon your knowing what the inflation rate was or something like that, right? And that's all knowledge. It's all going to be knowledge about the external world that's uncertain. So, when you put together different items of, different beliefs that you have that might or might not be knowledge. Well, you put together different beliefs that you have, and then you can infer something from it. So one of the beliefs is, well, I've got $100 in my wallet. And then the other thing is belief about the price level or something like that. And so if one of those beliefs is wrong, then the inference would be mistaken. But like I would say, well, it's not really like there's a big special problem with knowing the practical implications of your beliefs. It's just that, there are multiple beliefs involved. So like the risk of being wrong can go up if you had to put multiple beliefs together in order to infer your practical implications, right?
Yeah. It's almost like you start demanding more and more and more, and you can't quite justify all of the steps, potential, the premises that you're trying to get to for the conclusion that you're trying to reach. Go on. Sorry.
I was going to mention that, like an interesting point is sometimes the practical implications without knowing the theoretical thing. Because I was thinking this happens with scientific theory sometimes. Like sometimes there's more than one scientific theory that predicts kind of the same empirical results. All right, so a classic example is the Ptolemaic system of astronomy, which has the Earth at the center. And then there's the Copernican system, which has the sun at the center of the cosmos. And they predicted roughly the same things that you should see in the night sky. So in a sense, like, and we know that those predictions are approximately accurate, right? So in a sense, you know the practical implications without knowing the thing that is the basis for it, right? Because you might not know which of these alternative theories is correct. And indeed, it might be that something else that you haven't thought of is correct, right? But so like, what's going on with quantum mechanics? Well, we know that it makes correct predictions, and like that's pretty robust. So I would bet on the predictions of quantum mechanics continuing to come out true, but I would not bet on the theoretical explanation being vindicated.
That's so interesting. It reminds me of an example I used before, which is simply that you can put a satellite into orbit using Newton's laws of motion. But obviously we know that Einstein's theory of general relativity surpasses Newton's laws of motion. And we also know that Einstein's theory of general relativity and quantum mechanics come to loggerheads at certain elements. So there must be another theory that we need to get to eventually to begin to parse and separate these two. It's almost like there is a sort of truth or a close approximation to truth, but we're trying to build our knowledge up as we experience the world to get to a place. I mean, this kind of feeds into my sort of next question, which is something that people often ask in lectures that I've been in and those sorts of things, which is the sort of idea of knowledge being almost like conceptualized as a static foundational structure rather than a dynamic evolving process. How do you begin to, like, are those definitions correct, or how would you begin to try and explain what knowledge is?
Well, so, I mean, yeah, is knowledge static, or is it constantly changing? Well, the thing that you might have knowledge of might be changing, in which case your knowledge should change, or like your knowledge might become obsolete, so to speak, right? Although, like in that sense, well, it could still be, you could still have knowledge of what was the case, right? So in a sense, your knowledge would stay the same even if the world changes. But you might then acquire false beliefs because you might assume that it didn't change, okay? Our belief system should be constantly evolving because we're constantly getting new information. And hopefully our belief system should be improving. So we should be acquiring more knowledge, or, we should be getting more precise. And so, like you might have a question about whether, like if you already know something, you might think, oh, well, you can't improve on that. Well, we already know it. But you can have something that's sort of like, because it's already true. It can't get more true, right? But you might have something that's an approximation to the truth. You might get a closer approximation, which is what scientists usually say they're doing, right? Like they don't have the full truth, but they're getting closer to the truth. And that's a little bit it's a little bit questionable, because when you mention these examples where the scientific theory changes a lot, like from Newton's theory to Einstein's theory. So it's true that the empirical predictions are becoming more precise. Like there's a closer approximation to the truth in the empirical predictions, but the underlying theoretical explanation is not, it's not going in a line where it's getting closer to something, right? Like the underlying theoretical explanation could be completely different in the newer theory from what it was in the previous theory. So like, all massive bodies are attracting each other with this force. Or in Einstein's theory, there's no force of gravity. There's a curvature of space-time, which is just a completely different explanation of what's happening, right? Even though it gives similar empirical predictions, right? So in fact, there's even a question about whether we're getting closer approximations to the truth, right? We're getting closer approximations to the truth about the empirical predictions, but I don't know if we're approaching the truth about the underlying reality.
Yeah, and I guess another sort of sideball here. I'm aware that we've got to question 2, and there's loads of side tangents, which is great. But you could almost envision a sort of cul-de-sac of truth, where it's basically a dead end. So something like Islam. I don't think Islam's true, right? I think it's a cul-de-sac in regards to, if you're trying to get to truth, you've gone down a cul-de-sac and you need to turn around if you've gone into Islam. But I would say that it's still possible for people to know more about Islam. So it's obviously that's true. So it's not necessarily the case that it needs to be truth seeking, but actually knowledge itself can be about a field or a study or an area of exploration. Even if that area of exploration might think it's going after truth, it could be within a cul-de-sac. I don't know whether you could speak a little bit about does it need to track truth, or can it just go down whichever avenue it's trying to explore most?
Yeah, well, so you can have more knowledge about a false belief system, but there's a way in which your knowledge has to be true. Like, it's true that this is what Islam says. And so that's the sense in which you can have more knowledge about Islam, or that this is the tradition. But like, if you believe Islam and then you acquire more Islamic beliefs, you are not acquiring more knowledge, you're acquiring more error, right? And this is true of many belief systems. Don't want to only pick on Islam, but there are a lot of these. When you said that it's a cul-de-sac, my thought is, well, there are a lot of these belief systems that they include belief system defenses that are supposed to stop you from getting out of the belief system, even if it's false. Okay, so like the idea that faith is a virtue. And that's sometimes understood as not requiring evidence for something. Okay, that's a belief system defense. Like, that is a belief that you include in your belief system in order to let you keep holding it, even if it's false, right? Because like, if there was a false belief, how would you find out? Well, it would be like, I don't know, like there wouldn't be any evidence for it, or there wouldn't be enough evidence for it. Like, so now I'm going to adopt a belief that makes me keep holding it, even if that doesn't happen. And like, you might even think that it's a virtue to continue holding it in the face of evidence against it, right? So, okay. And then, like with some contemporary political beliefs, you have the belief system defense where you think that it's actually like the people on the other side are immoral. And so that means that you can't listen to them. And so, okay, well, that's a belief that if you think about, like, what is the function of that belief? It's to stop you from getting out of your current belief system, right? So like the people on the other side, they could give you evidence against your belief system. So let's adopt a belief that stops us from hearing that evidence, right? So anyway, okay, that's what I thought of when you mentioned getting into a cul-de-sac.
Interesting. I want to kind of touch then next on sort of a priori and a posteriori knowledge, basically this sort of idea that knowledge can be acquired independently of experience. You could look at something like a triangle is something that has, or let's use, a triangle is something that has three sides. If somebody said that in the Amazon rainforest they found a triangle that has 7 sides, you could know for a fact that they haven't found a triangle. What they're talking about is not a triangle, right? Or the sort of other area, a posteriori, is this idea that kind of knowledge is derived from sensory perceptions. There's obviously been sort of empiricism and rationalism. We're going to get to those in due course as well. But I thought it might be good just to touch on the two ways that we can come to knowledge.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so an example that I like to use is, so there's the belief that all bachelors are unmarried. That is an a priori belief. That is, I don't have to go out and I don't have to do a survey. I don't have to do experiments on the bachelors to make sure that they're unmarried. I just know that none of them are going to be married without looking. And then, here's another belief. Most bachelors are slobs. Okay, that's also true. But you do have to go out and look. Like, that's based upon observation of actual bachelors, right? Okay, so the first one is a priori. The second one is an empirical belief, or sometimes called a posteriori. So, so here's the test for an a priori belief. So there's some controversy about even whether there are any a priori beliefs, or whether there's any interesting substantive a priori knowledge. But so here's the test for something being a priori, according to me. If you're a brain in a vat, would you still know that thing? Right. So you imagine you're the brain in the vat, and the scientists are stimulating your brain to cause you to have experiences of living in the real world. Right. And so in this scenario, everything you experience is a hallucination. Okay. But would you still know that 2 + 2 is 4? And so I think the answer is yes. Right. You still know 2 + 2 is 4, even if you're a brain in a vat. So that means it's a priori. Right. So anything that you would still know, even if all of your observations are false, it's not based on observation in that sense. So it must be a priori.
I want to invite you to join our community on Locals. There is a range of free and supporter-only benefits to check out. On Locals, you can ask guest questions, access the reading plan to prepare for upcoming conversations, get early access to all the full-length video and audio versions of each episode, and meet like-minded followers of the show. The link is in the description, and I hope to see you there. So I want to talk then a little bit about a priori knowledge further than. So we kind of talked about empiricism and rationalism, and there's this idea of sort of analytic and synthetic knowledge or judgments. I'm not quite sure what the right term would be here, but I think it'd be good to kind of dive into those two facets of a priori knowledge. Like what is an analytic judgment, and what is a synthetic judgment or knowledge within that space?
Yeah, analytic statements are generally described as things that are true by definition. So if you just understand the meanings of the words in a certain statement, you can see that it's true, right? So like all triangles have three sides. If you thought that you found a seven-sided triangle, then you did not understand what the word triangle means. You must have misunderstood. Synthetic statements are just ones that are not analytic. And so, so there's a big issue about whether there's any synthetic a priori knowledge, right? Because like the vast majority of philosophers will agree that, there's analytic a priori knowledge. Like you could know a priori that all triangles have three sides because you understand the definition of a triangle. But are there any other things that you could know without observation that don't just depend upon understanding the definitions? Okay, so like here would be a contrast. You should not perform wrong actions, right? Actions that are morally wrong, you morally shouldn't perform. I know that a priori. Okay, that's analytic because, the meaning of the word wrong is that it's something you shouldn't do. Okay, but also you shouldn't torture babies for fun. That's synthetic. All right, so now, but I think I know both of those, right? So like that's an example of synthetic a priori knowledge. That is controversial because there's some people who claim that you don't know that. Like you don't know that anything is wrong, really. So, but it seems to me that I know that.
And how do both these things fit into the sort of empiricism versus rationalism then? I know kind of people look at someone like Hume as a kind of very well-known, or Adam Smith, kind of one of his contemporaries, as empiricists, the sort of key figures within empiricism in the 1700s. Obviously, rationalism, you speak about kind of yourself being, I don't know whether you say you're firmly within the camp, but you kind of lean more towards rationalism. And you also sort of mentioned Kantianism as well as another way of kind of going down this road. So I think it'd be interesting to kind of flesh out, especially empiricism and rationalism, and how they fit within this sphere.
Yeah. So the empiricists are the people who think there's no synthetic a priori knowledge. And the motivation for this was sort of, you can't know substantive facts about the world without having some kind of interaction with the world. Like that was the underlying thought. And then, so in their view, the role of reason, the faculty of reason, is simply to operate on the information that's provided by the senses and like make inferences from it. Okay, the rationalists thought, no, actually the faculty of reason, in addition to making inferences from information provided by the senses, it has some content that it can provide on its own. And so, like actually it turns out that you can know, in the rationalist view, you can know some substantive facts about the world outside your own mind. Just by thinking about it. Okay, so like the interpretation of mathematical knowledge, like the rationalist interpretation of mathematical knowledge is generally, there are these abstract objects that really exist, like the numbers and, shapes in geometry. And, like probability is a real phenomenon in probability theory, okay? And by thinking about it, you can just see the truth of certain axioms. And that's synthetic a priori knowledge. And then you can infer other things from that by which you build up the mathematical system. All right. So, the shortest path between any 2 points is a straight line. So that's an axiom of geometry. And, how do we know it? You just think about it and you just see that has to be true. Right. And you might think, does that depend upon observation? Because don't I have to I have to see lines in the world, right? But remember my brain in a vat test, right? Even if you're a brain in a vat, do you still know that the shortest path between any 2 points is a straight line? I think the answer is yes, right? So that shows that it doesn't depend upon observations.
Very interesting. Okay, I think it'd be good to turn to justification for a little bit. Something we've mentioned kind of right from the get-go, really. And it'd be helpful to understand how we can determine a belief is justified. Like what are the criteria we use to assess justification?
Yeah, good. So, justification is sort of like, does it make sense to hold this belief? Is it reasonable or rational? Right. And so my basic view, like there's controversy, epistemologists don't agree about this, but my view is the foundation of justification is appearances. So meaning that you start out by assuming that things are pretty much the way they appear, unless and until you have specific reasons for doubting that. And I claim that that's how you have to start. That's the only possible way of justifying anything. And if you think that you found some other method of justification, you're probably confused and didn't realize that that's just another way of relying on appearances. Okay, so you might think, oh no, I'm not going to rely on appearances. I'm going to observe the real objects, right? But no, what does that mean? Like, how do you observe real objects? Well, an object causes you to have experiences. So, I observe the cup, but what that means is that, the light from the cup goes into my eyes and then it stimulates my brain. And then I have an experience. And the experience is one of they're appearing to me to be a cup there. And then I accept that appearance at face value because I don't have any reason for doubting it. And right, but that whole thing is like that's what's actually happening when I say I'm forming beliefs based on the observation, right? Or, somebody says, oh, well, like I'm going to construct proofs of things, right? Like mathematical proofs. Well, okay, that's just like another version of assuming that things are as they appear until you have reason for doubting it, right? Because like, how do you get the axioms of your proof? Like in geometry, one of the axioms is the shortest path between 2 points is a straight line. Like, how did we know that? Well, you think about it and it seems obvious. And you don't have any reason for thinking that it's not true or thinking that there is something wrong with your way of forming that belief. So you accept that, right? Okay, so like, proving things is just like a subspecies of starting by assuming that everything is the way it appears unless you have reason to think otherwise. And observation is another version of that. And the scientific method also relies on appearances and so on. Like, everything that you would think of that you might think is another method of forming beliefs, it all relies on assuming that things are as they appear when you don't have reason to think otherwise.
Yeah, and we're going to dive into realism and indirect realism in due course as well. But I thought it'd be good to explore kind of what a defeater is, to a sort of prima facie justified belief as we've just been speaking about. But I thought it might be helpful to do it in light of the defeasibility theory. So I'm going to share my screen and then I'm going to read it out for those who are listening rather than watching, so they're on the same page as us. So the defeasibility theory states, S knows that P if and only if 1. S believes that P, 2. P is true, 3. S is justified in believing that P, and 4. There are no genuine defeaters for S's justification for P. So I think it'd be good to talk about defeasibility here. Like what is defeasibility and how do we begin to check our own beliefs with the light of defeasibility?
Yeah, good. Yeah, so this is one of the proposed definitions of knowledge, which is my favorite proposed definition, although I really think that it's undefinable, right? So it's undefinable, but this is the closest to being a correct definition. So the defeasibility theory is named after this last clause, that there are no genuine defeaters. So a defeater for your justification for P is a true proposition that if it were added to your belief system, it would result in your no longer being justified in believing P. So like, I gave the example earlier where you're looking at the stopped clock. You think it's 4 o'clock and it actually is 4 o'clock. In that case, the defeater would be that is a stopped clock. So when you're looking at the clock, you don't know that it's a stopped clock. But if you did, you would have to revise your beliefs. Or if you just added to your belief system the belief that there's a stop clock, then you wouldn't have justification for believing that it was 4 o'clock. So that counts as a defeater. Yeah.
I like it. I think it'd be good to talk about let's think of the right word here, rebuttals and undercutting defeaters. So there's sort of two ways that we can define defeaters here. I'll stop sharing my screen. So I'm going to use a sort of Christian analogy to kind of explain the two of these. If this is horribly wrong, Professor Huemer, please correct me afterwards. But I guess the sort of first one would be we could argue that the problem of evil is a rebuttal to Christianity, where if somebody was to find the body of Christ like a dead body, that would be an undercutting defeater to Christianity. Is that the right way to kind of view those two sorts of defeaters?
Well, so the first one was right. I think finding the body of Christ might also be a rebutting defeater. So,
okay.
So just to explain this, so yeah, the two kinds of defeaters. Rebutting defeaters are ones where, okay, so you believe P. The rebutting defeater for P is something that is on its own evidence that not P. Okay, and then the undercutting defeater isn't evidence that not P, but it's just evidence that there's something wrong with the way that you form the belief that P. So like a classic example is somebody told me that P, and that's why I believe it. And then somebody else comes along and says, no, not P. So then that's a rebutting defeater. Alternately, somebody else comes along and says, well, I don't know anything about P, but that person that you talk to is unreliable. Don't listen to him. So that's an undercutting defeater because it doesn't give me evidence of not P, right? So, okay, so when you find the body of Christ, so the thing is like the Christian doctrine says that he ascended to heaven. So if you found his body, that's direct evidence that he didn't ascend to heaven. So Christianity is false. What is an undercutting? Oh, a good undercutting defeater for Christianity would be something like, well, there's a really strong correlation between people's religious beliefs and like where they were born. And so if you'd been born in the Middle East, you'd be a Muslim now. If you were born in India, you'd be a Buddhist or Hindu, right? So that's not like directly evidence that Jesus isn't the Son of God or whatever, but it is evidence that there's something wrong with the way you form the belief, and that you would probably believe that, just because of where you were raised, even if it wasn't true.
That's really helpful. I'm glad that me putting my foot in my mouth is useful. I was definitely viewing it as there's these sort of pillars of Christianity, and if you could kind of undercut one of them, i.e., like find the body of Christ, then the whole thing would topple, rather than the problem of evil being a sort of something outside of Christianity that comes in and challenges it. So I'm really glad that you've kind of clarified that, because I'm sure others would make this. I hope that others would make the same mistake as that, right? So there you go. I think it'd be good then to talk about skepticism. Obviously, this is something that you kind of talk about quite a lot in your work. You also mentioned kind of that you think skepticism is a really interesting sort of puzzle piece to kind of play with, but not that it's necessarily true, right? We mentioned the sort of brain in a vat, a sort of external world skepticism quite a lot. So can skepticism about knowledge claims be adequately addressed? Or are there inherent limitations to human understanding?
Yes and yes. Yes to both. There are inherent limitations. Of course, there are limitations to human understanding. Although you put the word inherent, so I don't know if they're inherent. No. Well, yeah, there are some things that we'll never know. Like we'll never know. I don't know. We can't know what happened before the Big Bang, maybe, because all of the evidence of that was destroyed in whatever set off the Big Bang. But the skeptics claim traditionally that we don't know anything, or maybe that we don't know anything about the external world. We don't know any contingent truths about the world outside of our own minds or something like that. So, and I think this is wrong, but, of course we don't have complete knowledge, and we also don't have absolutely certain knowledge about the world outside our own minds. But we have, I would say, we have good enough knowledge, so to speak, right? Because you don't need absolute certainty. Who told you needed that? What and for what purpose did you need that? So, there's some, some like remote possibility that while we're sitting here, all of the air will just spontaneously migrate out the room just by chance, because all of the molecules just happen to be moving in that direction, right? Because they're all like moving around randomly. There's a chance that will happen. So, like if you ask me, hey, what are you doing after this podcast? I have to say, I don't know, because I might die. So I might suffocate because I don't have to take that into account. Actually, like if I'm a normal, sane person, I can ignore that possibility. And like, okay, it has a non-zero probability, but if the probability is like 1 in a Google, then I would say it doesn't matter. And I would say, like, we have a concept of knowledge. We should construe knowledge in a way that is a useful concept. Like we shouldn't devise a concept that would be completely useless, because it wouldn't enable you to communicate anything about anything that ever happens, right? Like, and the concept of knowledge, we use that to communicate things about like other people's cognitive state. You want to know if John knows what time the exam is for practical purposes, because like if he doesn't know, then I should tell him or something like that. And if you construed knowledge to mean, well, he's able to rule out possibilities with a 1 in a Google chance, then you always have to say, no, nobody knows. But then you just made the concept completely useless. And you also made it so that it doesn't apply to any of the cases that people apply it to, which I would say means that you're misunderstanding the word, right? Like if your interpretation of a word is such that the word, in your view, doesn't apply to anything that people actually apply it to, then you misunderstood. It's not that everyone else misunderstood. Anyway, okay, that was a bit of a side rant there.
No, I think it's helpful. Okay, I want to keep moving us along on where this is. I'm hopeful that this is getting people kind of riled up in a good way to want to go and kind of dive into epistemology more thoroughly. So I want to talk about theories of truth next. There's the sort of coherence theory and the correspondence theory. Would you mind touching on those two theories for us, explaining how they differ and which offers a more compelling account for truth?
Yeah, good. So the correspondence theory is the correct theory. Okay. The correspondence theory of truth is the theory that truth is correspondence with reality. So, somebody says the sky is blue, and what does that mean to say that? What does it mean to say that corresponds to reality? Well, it means that the sky is blue. Like if a person said that A is F and A is in fact F, then their statement corresponded to reality, and therefore would be true. And that's just what the word true means in ordinary English. The coherence theory is, no, truth is just like cohering with the rest of your belief system. If you have a belief system that fits together really well, and the different parts support each other, and there aren't any contradictions, and there aren't a lot of anomalies, right? Then that's a coherent system. Then it's true. And that's not correct. That's like, right. It's like one of the things is, well, you could have alternative coherent systems. And then there could be two incompatible propositions that each fit into different coherent systems. So then it looks like you'd have to say that incompatible things could both be true. And then that's a contradiction. Incompatible means they can't both be true. And why is the correspondence theory? Why is that a good theory? Like the only thing that we really know about true, or like the one central thing that we know about how the word true works in English is, if it's true that P, then P, and if P, then it's true that P. So if it's raining outside, then it's true that it's raining outside. Also, if it's true that it's raining outside, then it's raining outside. That's what I know. Okay. And the correspondence theory makes sense of that. And I think the other theories of truth that people devise don't make sense of that. Because if P coheres with the rest of your belief system, does it follow that P? No, it doesn't. And if P, if something occurs, does it follow that coheres with the rest of your belief system? No, that doesn't follow. like as far as I understand logic, right? And I'd say a similar thing about the pragmatic theory of truth, right? Which was recently made popular by Jordan Peterson, like who apparently endorses the pragmatic theory. If it's raining outside, does it follow that it's useful to believe that it's raining outside? No, it does not, right? And and vice versa. Or like a better example is, if it's useful to believe that God exists, does that make God exist? No. and this is actually a good example, because there's good reason to think that it is useful to believe that. Like people who are religious are, there's like psychological evidence that they tend to be happier than unreligious people, for understandable reasons, by the way, because everything bad that happens, they think there was a good reason for it. And they think they're going to heaven after they die, and it's going to be a paradise, whatever. So they're happier. So in a sense, it's useful to believe in God. It does not follow from that there actually is a God, right?
Interesting. Jordan B. Peterson, fascinating character. So I let's kind of, I guess, take a step back and then talk about sort of language and concept. So we come at everything through the way it's almost been kind of relayed to us, right? We sort of pick up words and we try to use those words in certain situations, and they either work or they don't, and then we learn from that how to use the words. Those words map onto different sort of kind of larger conceptual frameworks, like the family or society or whatever it is. So I guess it'd be good to try and understand how both language and concepts play a role in shaping our understanding of reality, and if they can actually hinder our ability to acquire knowledge, or if they help it more than hinder it. I don't know whether it's possible to kind of differentiate between the two of those, but language and concepts definitely play a role in some way for this.
Yeah. Well, so clearly the language that you speak and your conceptual scheme influence your knowledge and the way that you think about the world. I rather suspect that this has been exaggerated, by anthropologists. Right? So, okay, so like you sometimes hear, oh, the Eskimos have whatever 50 words for snow, or something, like really large number of words for snow, and like, isn't that amazing? No, that's not really amazing. Like, yeah, well, if you see something around a lot, then you're going to distinguish different kinds of it. But we do that too. But that's not like that doesn't mean that they have a really different way of perceiving the world. Like, I bet an Eskimo could explain to you what the different kinds of snow are. And I bet, I bet skiers have more words for snow than, non-skiers, right? So like, yeah, there's an influence, but it's not like that deep, right? Or, like I've heard suggestions like, when the Native Americans first saw the colonists from Europe arriving in their ships, they didn't notice them until they got on land because they weren't expecting that. That sounds like a load of BS, right? Like, okay, yeah, like your expectations affect reality, but not that much, right? It's only a little bit, right? So, okay, but mainly your language and your conceptual scheme, mainly they help you to understand real things. Because, like, we didn't evolve a bunch of tendencies, and, obviously, like, language use is an evolved tendency, right? The reason why we can learn language is there's an actual thing in your brain. There's an actual part of the brain that evolves specifically to enable you to learn languages, right? And it's not just general intelligence, because, like, the way that we learn language is phenomenally better than our learning of other intellectual things. Okay, so anyway, so we evolved this tendency to learn languages. We didn't do that because it was useless. Like, we didn't evolve to learn to understand language because it hurts your understanding of the world. No, it helps your understanding of the world. And how does it do that? Well, because other people have noticed things. They've noticed genuine differences and similarities in the world, and they gave them names. And then you become aware of them when you're trying to understand how these words work. Like, you hear a word that people are using, and then you try to understand why they're using it, or in what circumstance they're using it, and that makes you form the concept. And that's useful because almost all concepts correspond to something in reality, and usually it's something important. Like, something that's important enough to have a name is like probably something that you should know about, right? There's like infinitely many things in reality, right? So you gotta learn to distinguish, the important from the unimportant categories, right? There's infinitely many of them, and actually acquiring a language is a pretty good way of doing that, of like, making the useful distinctions and not the useless ones.
It's really interesting. So let's use an example of sort of, I guess, fundamental Christianity then. So somebody's raised in a sort of fundamental Christian framework. They begin to break free of that through whatever reason. And they are then trying to kind of, I guess, gain knowledge of the world outside of this sort of framework or the sort of conceptual framework that they've been given. I've got a lot of friends who are in that position who almost struggle to actually break the shackles off of those conceptual frameworks to be able to begin to retain things that are in opposition to what they once believed. I know that sounds weird, but actually I feel that there can be almost like a sedentary brain sort of flipping switch, which stops people from being able to actually begin to grapple with and push towards truth within areas that they didn't think there was once truth. Do you have any sort of thoughts or kind of ideas around concepts actually hindering the advancement of knowledge?
Yeah. I mean, yes. Well, so we were mentioning earlier that there are certain beliefs that hinder your cognitive progress because they're designed to stop you from questioning your other beliefs and themselves. So like the belief that faith is a virtue, designed to stop you from asking for evidence for things. And actually just like, to shut down objections. I think of skeptical theism this way, where like, you tell people about the problem of evil and they go, yeah, there's just like no way of predicting what the world would look like if there was a God. We have no idea like which evils he would allow and which ones he wouldn't. So we can't predict anything. So we can't infer anything from our observations of the world. Okay. Yeah. And then, okay, but those aren't exactly concepts. Those are, propositions. So it's sort of like an assertion that could be true or false. So I'm trying to think of examples of actually a concept. I don't know. I think maybe, so, there's George Orwell's concept of thought crime. Now, so if there's somebody who's using thought crime sort of unironically, like they're actually thinking of certain ideas as thought crimes, not like criticizing censorship or whatever, like they're actually on board with censorship because they think some thoughts are crimes. Okay. So then, yeah, that's a concept that hinders your acquisition of knowledge. Like hate speech is very close to that. I think that might be an anti-concept, as Ayn Rand says, right? An anti-concept is something that hinders your ability to integrate things in reality that belong together.
Interesting. I want to ask you about Ayn Rand, but we'll just park that. She seems to be somebody that a lot of philosophers absolutely hate, which is fun. Yeah. Okay, so you also speak at length in your book about sort of direct realism and indirect realism. I've got a question around sort of illusions and hallucinations, which we can get to momentarily. But before I dive into that, would you mind sort of speaking about what realism and indirect realism are as concepts?
Oh, yeah. So realism, so the word realism is used in like multiple different areas where it refers to a little bit different things. So, but, it generally refers to somebody thinking that something is objective and that we could know about it. So like moral realism, there are objective values and we can know about that. Okay, so in the theory of perception, realism is the view that, well, there's a real world. That is, there's a physical world that exists independent of us and independent of our minds in particular. And we can know about it. Okay, so, and the direct realists think, the way that we can know about the real world is direct. Meaning what? So, meaning that when you perceive something, you're aware of the actual physical thing. And you're not aware of the physical thing you're not aware of it indirectly. You're not aware of the physical thing through being aware of a mental thing. You're just aware of the physical thing. Okay. But also your beliefs about the physical world, they do not have to be inferred from other beliefs. So like, you see the cup, you're allowed to just start from the belief that there's a cup unless you have reason to think otherwise. You don't have to like start from a belief about your mind and then infer from the state of your mind that there's a cup. Okay. And the indirect realists think, the opposite of what I just said, that the indirect realists think, no, you're directly aware of a mental image of a cup, right? Like an idea of a cup, as, Locke and Berkeley put it, in your mind. And then you have to try to infer that there's a real physical cup that would be the cause of the mental image of the cup, right? Which, famously, Berkeley thought that you could not make that inference and that you should just think there's only the mental cup, right?
If you're watching this, then I just wanted to let you know that you can access the same content in audio-only form by subscribing via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Audible. In fact, you can search for the Socratic Sessions in your favorite podcast app. And whilst you're there, please leave a 5-star review. It helps others to discover these conversations. All links are in the description. And thank you. Something that you also push into in your book, which is quite interesting, and it's where my brain went to straight away. And then you shouted at people who thought this, which I was like, "Oh crap, that's me." But it's this idea that if you're a direct realist, so I've got a bottle of water here, I'm looking at the bottle of water. There is obviously a process going on, right? Light's bouncing off the bottle into my retina, my brain's processing it, and then I'm becoming aware that I'm seeing this bottle. People sometimes, as you mentioned in your book, think that actually that isn't kind of realism, that's indirect realism because of the process that's happening. Would you mind just clarifying for people listening why that isn't the case?
Yeah, good. Yeah, so the issue between the direct and indirect realists is not whether there are steps in a causal process in between the object and your having knowledge about the object. The issue is something like whether you make an inference or whether you would need to make an inference to justify the belief in the real object, and whether that inference would start from propositions about something non-physical, right? And also, like when I say you're directly aware of the cup, like the issue there is not whether I'm aware of the cup without depending on a causal process. The issue is whether I'm aware of the cup in a way that depends upon awareness of another non-physical thing, or whether I'm only aware of the physical thing, or like I'm originally aware of the physical thing. Okay, so like when I have this experience, am I aware of the experience or am I aware of the cup, right? So what I want to say is, okay, so the experience of the cup is my way of being aware of the cup. Like the function of experiences isn't to draw attention to themselves, it's to draw attention to the world. That like philosophers sometimes say the experiences are transparent. Like when you have an experience that makes you aware of the object of the experience. Okay. And so I'm not saying that it's impossible to be aware of your experiences, right? But I'm saying like when you have an experience, the main thing or the first thing that you're aware of is the object that the experience is of. And you can then like do some kind of introspective reflection and start thinking about the properties of the experience itself. But that's that's sort of a relatively unnatural and later thing that you do. Right. Like direct and indirect realists have sort of like opposite views of what's going on with the concept of sensory experiences. Like the indirect realists think, okay, the first thing that you noticed was that there were some experiences, and then you had to postulate physical objects to explain the experiences. And then the direct realists think it's more like the opposite. Like we first noticed that there were some physical objects around us, and then we posited experiences to explain how we knew about the physical objects. So there are times when, like I see a cup, and then there's sometimes when you know about the cup and other times when you don't know about the cup. And I think to myself, what's the difference? And then I think, oh, he has something going on in his mind that I'm going to call the experience of the cup. He has that in the conditions when he knows about it. And when he doesn't know about it, it's because he didn't have the experience of the cup, right?
So it'd be interesting then to, I guess, speak about hallucinations and illusions, just to kind of explain the differences between the two of them. A hallucination is when you believe you're seeing something that isn't actually there, whereas an illusion is where you're seeing something in a specific way that it's not being presented. So there's almost like there's this really famous one of a duck and a rabbit. If you're looking at the creature looking one way, you see a duck. The other way, you see a rabbit. It's really, really fun to look at, but it's obviously a sort of optical illusion. So how do kind of realists then, direct realists, begin to address things like illusions and hallucinations?
Yeah, good. So in a hallucination, you're having an experience that doesn't have an object, so to speak. Well, like that's how I would describe it as a direct realist. You're having an experience in which it seems as if you're aware of something, but there isn't actually anything there. Okay, so like you took some LSD and then you think that you're seeing a pink rat on the table, and the place where it looks to you like the pink rat is, there's literally nothing there, or there's just air there, right? Okay, that's hallucination. In an illusion, you're seeing a real object, but you're misperceiving its characteristics to some degree. So like there's the famous Mueller-Lyer illusion where there are two lines that are the same length, but they're like arrows pointing inward on one of them and pointing outward on the other one. Okay, and they look like they're different lengths, but they are not. Okay, it's not a hallucination because those lines are there, but it's an illusion because like you would be tempted to misjudge their relative lengths, right? So, okay, and so, what is it? So like there's this argument that's sometimes given that, oh, well, it can't be that you're directly aware of the real physical thing because, in this illusion case, you're aware of, you're aware of a line that's longer than the other one, but the real physical line isn't longer. So it must be that you're just perceiving the mental image of the line. Okay, and I have a hard time saying this argument because it's just so obviously false to me. No, you're aware of two lines and one of them looked longer than the other one, but it's not the case that it was longer. So you're not aware of a line that is longer. You're aware of a line that is the same length but looks longer. And I don't think that creates any problem for saying that you're aware of the real object. Then in the case of the hallucination, then people say, oh, well, you're seeing like a pink rat-shaped thing, but there's no physical object that's pink and rat-shaped. So you must be seeing a mental object. And then I would say, no, so you're not actually seeing any object. Like you're in a mental state that seems like you're seeing something, but you're not seeing anything because there isn't anything there to see, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting, sort of illusions and hallucinations. I mean, if it's going to be a bit of a weird question, I think it's one to try and, I guess, dive back into the idea of kind of defeaters for knowledge. So if I can't think of an example, but if there was something that was an illusion which most people had or consistently have to the point where we're never going to get past this sort of illusion, so we can use the brain in a vat example. If it isn't true, but there's no way we're ever going to know that it's not true, could it ever count as a defeater for knowledge? So we could believe that we have knowledge, that we know something to be correct and accurate, but actually there is a defeater. We're just never going to be able to broach it because it's on the other side of our cognitive faculties. Like, could that ever possibly be argued for? It's so far outside of us that it feels like it couldn't be, but I thought I'd ask the question anyway.
Well, I mean, you might think the brain of that scenario is like that, right? So yeah. In the brain of that scenario, there is a defeater out there, but we're never going to know because the simulation is perfect, and there are no mistakes in the program or anything. So, that short of crazy skeptical scenarios, there are cases where we would misperceive something, but it's generally discoverable. Okay, so why do people used to think that the sun goes around the Earth? And the natural answer is, well, it kind of looks like the sun is going around the Earth. Okay, and as a side point, Wittgenstein had trouble understanding this answer, and he said, well, how would it have looked if it looked like the Earth was rotating? Right, with the idea that it would look the same. So what do you mean that it looked like the sun was moving? But anyway, okay, but nevertheless, leaving Wittgenstein aside, most people would say, yeah, it looks like the sun is moving. That's why we thought that the sun was moving. But also, there are further implications which can be tested. Like, we could figure out that it was really the Earth rotating, because there's this Foucault's pendulum experiment where, you have a pendulum swing back and forth for a long time, and like the plane of oscillation slowly rotates. So, it winds up going this way and then like going this way. Okay, and so like that demonstrates that the Earth is really rotating, right? So like it's really hard to think of a case where we're subject to an illusion and there's no way of discovering it, unless you go to like crazy skeptic type scenarios, like, oh, we're living in a simulation or something like that.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, I was going to kind of push in and speak about the reliability of our cognitive faculties. Obviously, they are. I think it might be worth just touching this anyway, but they're obviously prone to error. They're prone to biases. I guess how far can we trust ourselves is probably the question I want to ask. Like, you could think that you are on the money on certain things, and actually you then read your book and you realize that actually you're just going down the lucky route or whatever it is, and you could begin to be challenged. But I guess there's sort of a place where people can come away being really uncertain about their cognitive faculties, or somebody could be way too confident about their cognitive faculties. How do we get the temperature right where we should be this confident about our cognitive faculties? Like, where is that place?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, because it's like a lot of people have the problem of overconfidence, and and I mean like their level of confidence, or the like probability that they would sign to a proposition, like is out of proportion to how often they're right. And by the way, there are psychology experiments demonstrating this, so it's not just my anecdotal opinion, right? Although lots of anecdotal evidence also suggests this, and like it seems like it's hard to get people to change their beliefs by giving them counter evidence, especially like if it's about religion or politics. So like it seems like that's the main problem. There aren't a lot of underconfident people. But then also it seems to me like, well, people are overconfident about controversial, difficult to know things, and they're underconfident about obvious, uncontroversial things. So like it's wrong to torture babies for fun. I think people are underconfident of that. Like there's a bunch of people who think, oh, I don't know, because that implies that morality exists. Maybe morality doesn't exist. And so like, okay, there are philosophical worries, which I think sort of like, they're outlandish, and they're sort of like, crazy person worries. And like, it's fine to think about them theoretically, but like in your sort of real life, when you're really thinking about like what to do, these philosophical worries shouldn't be influencing you. So people are taking things like that more seriously than the things that they should be taking seriously, which are like, maybe I'm wrong about abortion, like I'm a pro-choice person. Maybe the pro-lifers are right. I've gotten confused. Maybe fetuses are people, right? Like that you should take seriously, because that's a thing that a bunch of people really think seriously, and a bunch of smart people really think. And, they're not just like, philosophers who are raising armchair speculations think that, right? So, okay. But the other thing I want to say is, so, as individuals, we're very error prone, but I'm very impressed with the history of science. Like the things that people have figured out, it's really amazing. It's really amazing how good this institution is. There are various just very impressive people in the history of science, but also just like the whole process. It's just like a really good process if you apply it over a long period of time, right? Because I put that qualifier because like in most areas, we were totally wrong at the beginning. Okay. But over time, it just gets better and better. Okay. So like, well, you should be pretty confident of the stuff that humanity as a whole, like there weren't billions of scientists, but a lot of people over a long period of time, and they critique each other, and they're constantly like trying to find what's wrong with each other's ideas, and the ideas that survive over centuries, like those are pretty good, right? You should rely on that, and you should put more confidence in that than your own initial impression by yourself.
Very nice. Where we've kind of sketched around the houses on a lot of areas of epistemology. One of the areas we haven't touched on, and I thought I'd save it till last, is foundationalism. Well, we have touched on it, but we haven't dived into it necessarily. So I think it'd be helpful to first of all sketch out what foundationalism is, and if it's a viable theory of knowledge, and then we can maybe talk about some of the challenges from some of the different areas of epistemology. So first of all, Professor Huemer, what is foundationalism?
Oh yeah, so foundationalism is a view that, well, there are some things that you have non-inferential justification for, and they provide the basis for all of your other justified beliefs. And so the way this idea comes up is, somebody believes something, you can ask them what their reason for believing that is. And whatever reason they give, if they give a reason, it will be something else that they believe. And it seems like you could ask for their reason for believing that, and then you could just keep going. Okay, and so like if you have an annoying person, like an annoying 5-year-old who just constantly wants to know the reasons for things, where does it ultimately end up? And like one possibility is, I don't know, maybe you go in a circle at some point, like you give the kid a reason that you previously mentioned in the series, and then and now you can just easily continue to go around the circle. And then the kid is going to give up once he realizes how that works. Or I don't know, maybe there's just like an infinite series of reasons, that you can just keep providing reasons forever. Okay. Or the third possibility, or, like one possibility is actually there's no reasons for anything, which would be like the skeptical possibility. Okay. But then the last possibility is, there's some point at which, somebody asks for a reason for believing something, and it's somehow inappropriate to ask for that. Like, they're asking for a reason for something that you do not need a reason for, which is sometimes called self-evident or foundational. Right. So, my view that I mentioned previously could be rephrased as, well, what's foundational is the appearances. So if it appears to you that P, then P has foundational justification. Right. And by that, I specifically mean I don't need to give a reason for it. So it's subject to there being reasons against it. Like you can attempt to cite defeaters for the thing, but I don't have to cite reasons in favor of it to justify why I'm believing it. I get to believe it as long as there aren't reasons against it. Okay, so it's foundational in that sense, right? It's not that it can never be revised.
And two of the sort of ways that people talk about, two of the main ways I hear people speak about sort of foundationalist views are through things like the acquaintance theory of knowledge and also phenomenal conservatism, which you speak about. I think it'd be quite fitting to kind of close this conversation looking at the two of those and why you think phenomenal conservatism wins out in the race against foundationalism, against the acquaintance theory of knowledge.
Acquaintance theory.
Yeah.
So the acquaintance theory is that these are both forms of foundationalism. So what are the foundations? And the acquaintance theorists think, well, there's a special mental state called acquaintance, which is a kind of direct awareness of some object, right? And when you have this acquaintance with something, then you get foundational beliefs about it. Some of the basic things about it. Okay, so, and the people who hold this view usually say that what you're acquainted with is your own mental states and some abstract objects. And you have to put in the abstract objects to explain how you know that 2 is more than 1 and 1 + 1 is 2 or something like that, which you know a priori. Okay, and how is this different from the appearance theory? So acquaintance, they don't exactly have an analysis of that. Okay, but one thing we know about acquaintance is that if you're acquainted with something, that thing has to be real. There's no false acquaintance. Okay, but so that's one way that it differs from appearances, because there are false appearances. So it could appear to you that P when P is not the case. All right. Okay, good. And that's enough for me to explain why I think the appearance theory is better. So appearances rather than acquaintances are the basis for foundational justification. So it's possible to have a state that you would be inclined to describe as acquaintance, except that it's not correct. Right. So so famous example in the history of mathematics is when they were developing set theory, people thought there's this axiom called the naive comprehension axiom. It wasn't called naive at the time, but it is now called that, which is something like, if you have any predicate, then there is a set of all and only the things that satisfy it. Okay. So like there's the predicate red. And so there should be a set of all there's a set of red things which contains all of the red things and contains only red things. And that seems self-evident to most people. So they would have said that they were acquainted with the fact that makes that true. Okay, and then it turns out that that axiom is false because it entails a contradiction, which is known as Russell's paradox. Okay, because here's a predicate, is not a member of itself. All right, and that's perfectly well formed. There's nothing illogical about that predicate. So, okay, so then that means there should be a set that contains all and only the things that are not members of themselves. And then you ask, is that a member of itself? And so then it has to be a member of itself if and only if it's not a member of itself. So that's a contradiction. Okay. So the axiom has to be false. It has to be not true that there's always a set of all the things that a predicate applies to. Okay, but the thing is, like, when people thought about the comprehension axiom, they had an experience which felt to them just like the experience that they have when they think about the other axioms that are actually true. Right. And so, like, I would say it seems to me like, well, they were justified in believing the comprehension axiom before they discovered the paradox. They were justified in believing the axiom in the same way that they were justified in believing the other axioms. And, like, you know, they couldn't tell the difference between them. Right. But they weren't acquainted with the fact, like, you know, the fact of the comprehension axiom, because there's no such fact, because it's not true. Okay. So then that means that your justification for believing the other axioms also is not acquaintance, right? It's appearance. The reason you were justified in believing the comprehension axiom is that it seemed true and you didn't have reasons for doubting it. And your reason for believing the other axioms is the same because you can't tell the difference. So your reason for believing the other axioms is also that they seem true and you don't have reasons for doubting them.
What a beautiful way to close the conversation. Other than somebody picking up your book, Understanding Knowledge, where would you want to point people to learn more about you and to read more of your work?
So, you know, you should get my book on Amazon. But also, I have a blog, Fake News, on Substack. So FAKENOUS. Because that's the Greek word nous is the word for mind. And there's a famous philosophy journal called News. All right. So I have Fake News. All right. So anyway, people should go to my blog. If you look for Fake News, on Substack, you'll probably find it.
Amazing. There'll be a link to that and a link to some of your work in the description. So listener, viewer, check those out. And Professor Huemer, it's been an absolute delight to chat with you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks for checking out this episode. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And make sure you check us out over on Locals. Cheers.